Hello there, and welcome back to the Level 2 lessons for the Star Wars Unlimited Judge program. As always, I'm your host Jonah, and today we're going to dive into investigations. We've talked about them a lot in preceding lessons, and then the head judge should investigate. We're actually going to break this down into two lessons, objective investigations and subjective investigations, but we're finally going to dive into it. Now, some folks might refer to objective investigations as game state investigations, handling calls, lowercase I investigations, determining reality, factual investigations, or any of a variety of other names. Similarly, folks might call subjective investigations, cheating investigations, capital I investigations, determining intent, or again, a variety of other names. The difference is whether or not we're based on player intent or game state facts. Now, an investigation is anytime you want to get information from players, which means pretty much every time you interact with players. I can say with confidence that the vast majority of my calls include at least one question. What can I do for you? You might not think of this as an investigation, especially given the tendency to focus on cheating investigations, but it's important to learn objective investigations as well. Far more calls involve you needing to figure out something that's based in identifiable facts and through cooperative communication with players than calls that involve you needing to make a determination of whether or not a player is cheating. We're going to take a look at a few specific subcategories of objective investigations. Before we do that, I want to remind you of the categories of calls that we discussed back in the Level 1 lesson on judge calls: empirical, cooperative, contentious, and combative. With most objective investigations, you're going to either have an empirical call or, at the very least, have players who are cooperating with you, even if they're in contention with each other. If players are in contention with each other about what happened, it can be helpful to separate them so that they can relate their perspective without being corrupted by the other person. However, having both players at the table means that a player can issue corrections or amendments like, everything my opponent said is correct except I also attacked with Greedo over there. Now, with these calls, you're determining what has mechanically happened in the game. This is events that have occurred, and so you're trying to recover facts. You have a lot of tools at your disposal, and we're going to walk through them. You have the cards in play, the distribution of damage, tokens and counters on cards in play, and cards in discard as some very clear pieces of evidence. You have the number of resources a player has, whether they're exhausted or ready, and the number of cards they have in their hand or deck. Sometimes you have a player's notes, which often include an auxiliary set of tracking for base HP or other key information. Beyond that, you have the memory of both players, spectators, and the possibility to discuss strategy and intent with the players after separating them. And this also means that you have access to the identity of cards in hands and in resources, which can sometimes help you reconstruct a game state. Now, let's start with a common piece of information that you need to find. What part of the deck is random and which part is known? This is a piece of information that we use frequently, most often in resolving card manipulation errors, but sometimes in other fixes as well, and sometimes it's just something that we need to know for our investigation. When a player is instructed to put cards on the bottom of their deck by an ability, and later we need to randomize the deck for a fix, we want to preserve those cards in that location because the game hasn't instructed the player to shuffle those cards in. And so any cards that the player, for example, wanted to take but had to put on the bottom should remain there, or any cards that they didn't want shuffled into their deck and intentionally put on the bottom of the deck, those should also remain there. Now, this is often straightforward. The key question is, do you know the location of any cards in your deck? I usually name a few cards with relevant effects, anything like U-Wing Reinforcement, Inferno 4, Restock. By naming a few frequently played cards that have non-matching aspects or see play in different decks, we're not providing any significant information to the opponent. We're not implying that these cards are in the player's deck, but instead referring to a class of ability. We can also check to see if the player has shuffled their deck recently. While there aren't currently many cards that result in the whole deck being shuffled compared to the quantity that put some cards on the bottom of the deck, if the player has shuffled the deck, we only care about the cards that they've put back into their deck in a specific location since the shuffle, because the deck was fully randomized at that point in time. If the player says no, that they haven't put any cards into the deck, you can always check with a couple more examples, because frequently players do forget something and take the extra second or two to confirm. Helps ensure that we don't damage the game state with our remedy. If the player doesn't remember, it's time to start digging. First, let's look at any cards in play and check to see if they have any action or trigger abilities that might affect this. For each one, we'll ask how it was resolved. Did you put any cards on the top or bottom? Do you remember how many? If things get complicated, it can be very helpful to keep track of the count in a notebook, so you don't have to keep a number in mind. For action abilities, you have to figure out how many times they were activated, but there's usually some contextual information that can help. If you're looking at the leader Yoda sensing darkness, his ability can only be activated in phases where a unit left play, and comes with the player drawing a card, so they might be able to remember, I definitely drew this card off Yoda, it wasn't with another card, it wasn't during my regroup. Or, I activated him when I defeated that unit, that was a different time. We can, of course, repeat the process with the discard and confirm that no cards that have impacted the deck order were returned to hand or resources or deck, similar to effects on Bounty Hunter Crew or Restock. The process is straightforward and frequently not complicated. Most of the time, there are only a couple of effects that need to be considered. Once we've considered them, we now have the location of cards in the deck. The next process is for helping evaluate for rewinds primarily, determining game history, but has a lot of spillover into other remedies and other parts of investigations. Sometimes you don't need the information to apply the fix, but you need to understand what the actual issue or concern is. Very frequently, we don't need to understand just what is currently happening, the game state, but also what has come to pass before, the game history. As we discussed above in determining the random portion of the deck, sometimes we need to figure out how many times an ability was activated, or how many times a unit attacked, or what round we're on. The best way to figure out what has happened in the game is to pick a point on the timeline, either the current moment with the current game state, or the point that you're interested in, the first time a unit attacked, when an error occurred, etc. I recommend starting with where we are now, because it's easier for players to recount what has happened most recently. They have the cards in front of them and have to rely on memory less. As they go back in time, they're able to reconstruct game events. Oh right, before I attacked with Sabine, I played Daring Raid to defeat your Sentinel, and they can build on that. However, sometimes players have the whole history ready to go from the inciting moment, and so you can take that and work with it. Like with determining the random portion of the deck, you should be looking at cards in play and in discard to determine what has happened. However, we're going to want an even wider scope because we're looking for more information. You're more likely to look at both players' game states, linking cards in discard to units in play and discard. What did this takedown defeat? Okay, and how was its on-defeat trigger resolved? Frequently, discard piles are in chronological order, and so going step by step, you can take cards from the top and dig deeper until you find your stopping point, and they contain a ton of information. If players stumble in their recollection, separate them and talk to them one at a time. Ask them what their line of thinking was around the plays that they do remember, and see if that helps them jog their memory of what else was happening. Because you're discussing strategy, you want their opponents out of earshot, and ideally accompanied by another judge. Next, we're going to talk about card counts. Sometimes a player will accidentally draw an extra card, or sometimes we won't be able to be sure if they've drawn an extra card or not. Furthermore, we sometimes want to figure out what round of the game we're on for determining game history. To do that, we use one of a variety of methods to count cards. The goal of any card counting exercise is to determine how many cards that player has removed from their deck by way of their opening hand, drawing for a regroup every round, and from abilities and effects. Let's say a player isn't sure if they drew one card or two this regroup, and they call you over to ask for your assistance. There are two common approaches to counting cards. I'm going to cover both, and you can practice and determine which one suits you better. In either case, the goal is to compare a player's accessed cards to either the current round, if it's known, or the other player's accessed cards. That's some nonsense technical language, so let's walk through an example. A player calls you over because they're unsure if they've drawn for their heroic sacrifice or not. They resolve the attack, and now, looking at their hand, can't remember what card they drew, and so aren't sure if they did draw one. One approach looks at the game holistically, and the other looks at it on a card-by-card basis. Let's start with a card-by-card approach. All we do is look at each card that a player has played and assign it a value based on how many additional cards it allowed the player to access. Any cards that leave the deck and are not returned are considered accessed and are worth +1. For example, the aforementioned heroic sacrifice is worth +1 because it draws one card. Ewing reinforcement is +0 to +3 because it can put as few as 0 and as many as 3 units into play. All smuggle cards have at minimum a +1 if they're smuggled, because they take a card out of the deck and add it to the resources. Cobb Vanth, even though the card goes directly from deck to discard, is also +1 because the card is being removed from the deck and is now accessible. Restock can be worth up to -4 if you return 4 cards. However, not every card that allows you to take cards out of the deck allows you net access. For example, Yoda Sensing Darkness, while he draws you a card, you also put a card back in the deck, so his leader-signed action is worth 0. Similarly, Bounty Hunter Crew, while it returns a card from your discard to your hand, and you're able to replay the card, while you've accessed the card again, that doesn't take a card from the deck and is also worth 0. Once you have the final count of cards, count all of the cards not in the player's deck, no matter what zone they're in, then subtract the value you have. The result will be the number of cards that the player had in their starting hand, plus the number of cards that they've drawn for their regroup. The other method starts the other way around. We begin by counting every card that the player has access to currently, and subtracting the starting hand and cards for regroup, and then have a number of additional cards that they've accessed, and go through the game history to determine how that quantity of cards was accessed. Both methods are essentially the same. They're both math, totaling up the total number of cards accessed, figuring out where they came from, and then checking to see if the numbers add up. It's just the process portion that's a little bit different. Sometimes you won't know what round it is, especially in the late game. Players may have skipped resource drops to make it a little bit more difficult for you. To determine the round in this case, begin by counting the other player's cards. We act under the assumption that they have the correct quantity of cards. We get the total, subtract starting hand, and then additional cards accessed, and that should leave us with the number of cards drawn for regroup, which will be the same for both players. We can then use that to determine the original player's card count. Now, make sure you don't miss something like the base Colossus, which will reduce a player's count by 1. You'll also want to check with players to see if any cards could have been accessed that have returned to a hidden zone. Returning a restock to your hand with Bounty Hunter Crew can have a significant impact on the card count, and so you want to make sure that you don't miss that. Of course, every card that has been resolved has been public, and while you don't want to reveal if the player still has the card in hand, you can ask the players at the table if any cards like that have been returned to hand and can confirm with the opponent. Now, sometimes players will disagree on the amount of damage on a unit or base, and this is moving into damage discrepancies or base health discrepancies, although this is more frequently bases than units. When this happens, we again need to reconstruct the game state and game history. One of the most powerful questions you can ask is, how did this happen? It's very broad and gives players the space to include additional information that can help your investigation. Look at the discard and cards in play, and account for units that may have attacked, account for healing, and make your best judgment. This is more likely going to come up when players are independently tracking both base damage totals, rather than just relying on their opponent keeping track on their base. Frequently, at large competitive events, players will be tracking damage totals on a sheet of paper. While a written record can be maliciously altered or accidentally misrecorded, it is easier for dice to be accidentally mishandled or jostled, resulting in an inaccurate game state. This means that you shouldn't rely absolutely on a written health or damage total, but you can use it as a resource. You can see the action history, you can see the increments of damage, and see that, for example, a player marked their damage total going from 16 to 19 most recently, but their opponent has had any units with 3 power in play for a very long time. This is likely erroneous, and so you can look for a unit that had 2 power or a unit with 4 power and see if it attacked during that time frame to figure out if the correct total is 18 or 20. Now, let's talk about player testimony. The challenge with all this, we call these objective investigations, that we're relying on facts and elements that you can look at directly and compare. However, you'll note that most of the time, the way we're getting this information is by asking players how things occurred. And there are, of course, a couple underlying concerns here. The first is that while we generally believe that players are honest and trying to help us come to a correct and natural conclusion, there are some players who will be acting maliciously and will give us bad information. The second is that people are actually really bad at genuinely remembering things, broadly speaking. Next time you're playing, have a friend come up to you after the match and have them ask you which player started with the initiative, or if you took a mulligan. There's a pretty good chance that you won't be able to remember it, or if you do, your memory might be partially fabricated or mixed in with another game or match. Players will misremember things frequently. This is why we need a little bit more security than just asking a player what happened. You want to look at the elements of objective evidence. Card counts can reliably tell you how many cards a player has accessed, if not how, and written damage totals are much more concrete than a player memory. And this is why I encourage all competitive players to track damage totals on players. It protects both them and their opponent from errors. You also want to confirm with the opponent. While you may separate the players to discuss what happened exactly and ask questions about strategy and plans to help jog the player's memory, you want to bring them back together at the end and lay out your complete understanding of factual events, which are all public. Take the evidence that you have, but reinforce that evidence with other elements so that you can be more confident in your final judgment. Sometimes, however, you're not going to have that confidence. You're not always going to be able to nail down the certainty of what happened, or there isn't enough evidence one way or the other. One player remembers things playing out one way, the other playing out another. This is where your judgment comes into play, and you have to make a decision. Sometimes you can dig a bit deeper into talking with the players about why they believe that the game played out that way, but it can be really difficult. However, for the game to move on, you need to make a ruling. Express to the players your understanding and what you're basing your understanding on, whatever evidence you have. Let them know that this is your final ruling. However, be prepared to be appealed. In these circumstances where there isn't concrete evidence or at least a compelling sequence of events, it's active player said versus non-active player said, and the player you don't end up ruling in favor of is likely going to seek an alternate opinion. Don't take that as an evaluation of yourself. Accept it as something that happens in situations that aren't wholly precise. Speaking of that lack of clarity, it's starting to delve into subjective investigations, which we'll dive into in much more detail in our next lesson. If you're watching this on YouTube and you want more Level 2 lessons in your feed, go ahead and subscribe. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays on twitch.tv/SWU_judges for live broadcasts covering the content of these lessons as they are released, and join the Star Wars Unlimited Judge Program Discord to join the community and discussion of this and much, much more. As always, good luck and have fun.